This is a video about the making of Wall of Waste, a sculptural installation that Art of Diversion debuted at the 2023 Australasian Waste and Recycling Expo, which is an annual trade show and summit for the waste management, recycling, and resource recovery sector. This year, AWRE was held in July at the International Convention Center right here in Sydney. About a month before the event, I reached out to the event organizers with a proposal to do an art installation on the exhibition floor. The installation would be waste and recycling themed, of course, but beyond just using waste materials as the medium to construct the piece, I also felt this would be an ideal opportunity to encourage people to see materials that are typically thought of as waste in a new way, as works of art in their own right, not just waste. I noticed that AWRE was using a sort of Bauhaus pattern and a color palette of yellow, blue, and green in the branding for the event, so I wanted to incorporate some of these graphic elements and colors into the installation. I also love collage and assemblage as art forms. And I've always wanted to do something with anamorphic signage, so my idea was basically to combine these approaches, aesthetically but also thematically and materially, to essentially create an assemblage of waste designed to present waste from a new perspective, literally. The event organizers were super cool and receptive to the idea, and so I began the process of refining my initial concept, sourcing the necessary materials, and creating the piece, which, as you'll see, was in some ways much easier than expected, but in some ways much more complicated than expected. Such is the nature of making things out of whatever materials are at hand. Because I'm planning to do larger scale pieces like this, I've recently become a tenant at a shared studio space above a timber reclamation workshop called Among the Trees in the Sydney suburb of Marrickville. If you're in Sydney, definitely check them out, support local, and use reclaimed timber instead of new timber whenever possible in your projects. Anyway, I've only ever previously created works in the solitude of my own home, so the change in environment has been incredible. It's nice to work in a space surrounded by other artists, makers, and craftsmen, and it's also just nice to be working in Sydney's inner west. There's a well-established maker community here. Some of Sydney's coolest small businesses are located here. It's just a great vibe and energy to it. I would describe the urban fabric as sort of industrial and funky. The area is full of great street art and inspiring colors and textures. Some of the material that I ended up using in the Wall of Waste I found just by walking the streets on my way to and from the studio. While reclaimed building materials are Art of Diversion's primary focus, and I initially thought about building the structural base for this installation using reclaimed timber, unfortunately, I think that would have been a little more challenging and time-consuming than what I had time for, and more importantly, I really needed the wall to be quite large while also being lightweight and easily reconfigurable and portable. So while cardboard and plastic are not necessarily my preferred medium, in this case they were exactly what I needed. And let me just say, it was all too easy to find these materials. Art like this is about working with whatever materials are at hand, and for better or worse, anyone living in pretty much any city will find that there is no shortage of cardboard and plastic readily available everywhere. I started simply by looking at whatever I had around the house, which turned out to be quite a lot, and around the neighborhood. I didn't have to look very far, and I popped into a few local shops who graciously let me help myself to their vast assortment of spare boxes that they didn't want anyway. I even called in a favor to a few friends via a group chat. I just said, hey, if anyone has any recyclables that they don't mind setting aside for the next couple of weeks, I'll take them, and they gladly chipped in. I also sourced a few items from Gumtree for free or next to nothing, and apps like Gumtree and online groups like Buy Nothing and Street Bounty are super handy for artists and makers, and I highly recommend them to anyone who wants to support your local secondhand economy. But honestly, you don't even need to go online. You can just wander the streets and back laneways of your own neighborhood like I did a few times and find heaps of good stuff to work with. It's amazing what people will throw out. And last but not least, I have to give a huge shout out to two local social enterprise environmental organizations. First, a huge thanks to Reverse Garbage, a not-for-profit creative reuse center based in Marrickville that is an incredible source of all kinds of materials that are perfect for projects like mine. It's what most people would probably consider junk, but it's the kind of place where I could spend hours browsing. I got some key items for my Wall of Waste from Reverse Garbage, and frankly, had it not been for the materials that I discovered there, I'm not sure how the wall would have turned out. Finally, I want to also thank Banish, whose Banish Recycling and Disposal Program, aka BRAD, is putting a huge dent in the plastic waste problem and also helping to educate the local community about how to recycle and properly dispose of those hard-to-recycle household items. Please, if you're in the Sydney area, support these awesome local organizations. Back to the making of the wall. As I said, I needed this thing to be pretty lightweight, so enter the humble, plain cardboard box. My canvas, so to speak, was essentially made out of a series of uniform columns that were about 2.5 meters or 8 feet tall. Each column made up of 21 cubes, each cube formed out of 8 smaller boxes. If you do the maths, I painstakingly constructed some 168 cardboard boxes. And if you're wondering why I didn't just use fewer, bigger boxes, it's because firstly, this wall needed to fit within a certain size space for the event, so the dimensions were dictated by that and needed to be rather precise. And because, well, these were the only boxes that I could find on short notice given my shoestring budget and time constraints. Using fewer, bigger boxes would have been easier and much less time consuming. I just wasn't able to find enough boxes that were the perfect size for the columns that I wanted to make, but I was okay with that. Again, this was an exercise in using found objects and readily available materials, and as it turned out, the smaller boxes ended up working quite well structurally. I'm also pretty good now at putting boxes together rather quickly, so I got that going for me, which is nice. Although tedious at times, I did find working with cardboard as a medium to be quite satisfying in its own way. Simply by repeatedly handling the material and getting really familiar with its capabilities, I started to appreciate its potential. I now have all kinds of ideas for other projects and works of art that could be made out of unwanted cardboard. For instance, my homage to Joseph Albers' Homage to the Square, or as I like to say, my garbage homage to the square, was something that just came to me as I was cutting up pieces of cardboard for the wall one day. Likewise, that led me to doing an assemblage of some cut-up safety signs as a way of paying homage to one of my all-time favorite Kiwi Australian artists, Rosalie Gascoigne, who was a master of salvage and using found objects like old road signs and weathered backcountry materials. Now that I've accumulated a lot of cardboard and plastic materials to work with, I can foresee myself embarking on a series of works that expand on these little experiments. We'll see. Side note here about artistic intent. It was very interesting hearing what people thought of the wall as it was coming together and at the event. I wasn't necessarily going for anything provocative. My intent was primarily for it to be a subtle critique of consumerism and excessive packaging while blurring the lines between waste and art. I just want to encourage people to buy less stuff to begin with and to think twice before tossing out materials that could be reused. At no point was Wall of Waste meant to have anything to do with Ukraine, that was a popular one, or IKEA. Can't imagine why anyone would think that. Or the video game Monument Valley. I see it. Or the beach, or plastic waste on the beach. I see it, and yes, plenty of work to do there. Or alcoholism. Although I suppose I may have subconsciously been crafting a message about being several months sober or unwasted while working on this. And finally, it wasn't meant to be about the Matildas, but in fairness, this was happening during the Women's World Cup, with festivities taking place right outside the ICC. These were all things that people said came to mind when they saw the wall, which I totally get given the color palette and some of the materials, and yeah, all happy accidents, I guess. And that's the beauty of art sometimes. It can be open to endless interpretation. An artist's intent is, after all, only one part of the art experience equation. The rest is up to the viewer. No making of video would be complete without sharing a few lessons learned. First, I love a good figure it out as you go project, which this was, but it was also a classic careful what you wish for project. For me, creating such a large-scale assemblage piece was a constant struggle. As the form emerged, and as I began applying the materials to the surface, I wasn't sure if I was striking the right balance between less is more versus more is more. I would have given anything for another day or two to finesse the arrangement a bit. For instance, I would have loved to have figured out a clever way to make the columns swivel or even have each individual box rotate independently without me doing it manually, but maybe that would have been too much. This is one of those projects that if you'd given me another week or another month to work on it, I'm sure I would have found a way to continue tweaking it to death, and I'm not sure it would have paid off. So first and foremost, there's an important lesson in there somewhere about just knowing when to stop. I think, like most creatives, I have a love-hate relationship with deadlines. In this case, having a deadline was almost certainly a good thing. Secondly, it didn't occur to me until I got to the actual event and witnessed the way that people engaged with or completely ignored the wall that I wish I would have made it a bit more interactive. In hindsight, maybe I could have gamified the experience a bit, made it into some kind of puzzle for viewers to figure out, or at least offered something for the event attendees to physically take away from the installation, like an actual piece of the wall, a little memento. I don't know. All ideas to explore next time, I guess. I did invite a bit of audience participation in the end for the reveal of the "Make Art Not Waste" message, and I'm pleased to say that overall the wall seemed to catch people's attention in the way I intended. For the time that I was in attendance myself at least, I did have a handful of people stop and take a closer look at it, and in some cases ask me good questions about it, which was gratifying and really all I could have hoped for. Thirdly, another big lesson learned was that I underestimated the headache of dealing with the logistics of getting something this large from the workshop to the venue. There was literally a moment where one of my studio neighbors asked me, "How are you going to get this to the convention center?" To which I responded, "I have absolutely no idea." To which he reassuringly responded, "Oh, worry about that later," which I did. Anyway, despite being relatively lightweight, the cubes were deceptively backbreaking to work with and move around. There's a reason they say lift with your legs, and I learned the hard way that that applies to lifting large, cumbersome boxes even if they're not all that heavy. Lastly, a totally unexpected lesson learned was that I found myself in a not-so-sticky situation in making the wall. I inadvertently gave my entire canvas a slippery, Teflon-like character due to the layer of protective film that I used to wrap the boxes. As mentioned, I was thrilled to have found at Reverse Garbage materials that fit the color palette and were otherwise easy to work with. But for a couple of days, I couldn't figure out a good way to get anything to adhere to these boxes, which was getting frustrating and disconcerting. I ended up finding a double-sided tape that did the trick, but it was not without some trial and error and some disastrous results with various glues, including super glues meant to work on plastics. Turns out, if you read the fine print, even most super glues don't work very well on certain kinds of plastic. I probably dodged a bullet there anyway, because I think I would have ended up making some of these materials ironically less recyclable had I covered them with a bunch of glue. So what happens to the wall next? Admittedly, using waste materials to make art merely prolongs the inevitable, but that's kind of the point. It's exactly at the heart of why I started Art of Diversion. I would rather make art and installations and products using reclaimed materials than new materials. I would rather intervene and intercept materials that someone else doesn't want and make something new out of those materials, even if it's just a work of art and something not particularly functional per se, as opposed to doing nothing at all and risking those materials ending up in landfill. Wall of Waste has given a handful of discarded materials a new life temporarily. Now that the AWRE event is over, the wall is sitting in storage for the time being, but I plan to loan it out and find new uses and locations for it for as long as possible. Until which time I will inevitably disassemble it and ensure that all the materials are properly recycled, and I plan to document that process when the time comes. But yeah, until then, the Wall of Waste installation is available to anyone who wants it. The wall would love to spend some time in your office building lobby, or maybe your shopping center, or school, or gallery, or local government building. I could go on. In all seriousness, I'm shamelessly asking anyone to please get in touch if you think you might have a place where it would make sense to display this so that passersby can see it. I'll gladly deliver it to you. So, although I might have done a few things differently knowing what I know now, it was totally worth it, and I would absolutely do it all over again. Wall of Waste was the start of something. If nothing else, it was the start of an ongoing conversation about the intersection of waste and creativity. I, for one, believe that art is as good a use for materials that would otherwise go to waste as any, and I look forward to bringing you more of it.